Good morning, everyone. How you all doing? Okay, there we go. Somebody woke up suddenly. Excellent, good, well done. So welcome. Thanks for joining us. I want to welcome everyone online as well. Hi, folks. Just a quick reminder to, in the app, if you haven't done this already, add this session to your schedule. You can then get to the session survey. We on the program committee would really appreciate your feedback. I know the presenters would as well. We're likely to run pretty much to time with this one, so if you do have questions, either grab Jonas after the end or put the questions in the app and we will try and get those across to Jonas afterwards. Can't promise, but we'll do our best. With that, we're going to get started, and I'm going to leave you in Jonas's very capable hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. You can also find me on LinkedIn. There's not too many Jonas Iggboms on there. It's a pretty unique name. Although I have a cousin named Johan Iggbom, he would not get these questions at all, I think. So I'm going to talk a little bit about removing, we all know about removing the password, right? If you don't know what passkeys are, you failed this these last couple of days. So that's the no password part. I'll talk a little bit about that, but the main part of this is actually to remove the browser in authentication. And hands up, who's familiar with OAuth and OpenID Connect? Big chunk. You probably are all familiar with the fact that these flows run in the browser, right? So I'm going to talk about how to not run them in the browser, predominantly on mobile devices. And we're going to do this using something called a Hypermedia API. And we're going to use it for authentication. But a Hypermedia API doesn't have to be used for authentication, but that's what I'm going to show and talk about. I hope to get to a demo at the end here where we run this on an iPhone. So a Hypermedia API in general is essentially a state machine. It takes information that comes from the resource server. And if we think about this from an authentication perspective, the resource server is actually the authorization server. It's the OAuth or OpenID Connect provider. We're going to get a response from that contains essentially links to other resources. And what happens with this is we move the logic from the client to the server. So the server kind of keeps the state of this state machine and just feeds the client information that the client acts on. And typically these are links that the client doesn't assume exist, but it has information about the payload that comes back, and it can then transition to a different state client side by following these links. A link could also be a link to perform an action, like display this button could be something. But if you think about it from an authentication perspective, what could happen in this payload that comes back is that we get an array of possible mechanisms to authenticate. There's links to each of them, authentication mechanism 1, 2, and 3. And the client then points to the second authenticator, for example, and that triggers a different state on the client. Some of those states might need to send something back to the server. The server acts on it, returns the payload back again, and then it goes sort of back and forth in states if it has to. So what are the drivers around doing something like this? It works, right? We can run these flows in the browser. I'm sure you've all seen mobile applications that invokes the web view, as we call it. You basically pop out of the application, you perform your authentication, and then you're sort of back into the application. Not a super good user experience. You leave the application. The other part about this is the application developer themselves actually lose control in this situation, right? Because what happens in that web view is you have a server-side rendered authentication. It's a browser that renders the authentication. So the application developers, they control the UX of the entire application, but they don't control the UX of the authentication screen. That's fully in control of the authorization server that renders it in the browser. So by removing the browser here and running this natively in the application, the app developers can use native native widgets in their development and technologies that they're used to, and above all, they have full control over the UX, exactly how this authentication screen should be rendered and displayed within the application. So some of the challenges that this solves is obviously but third-party cookies are going away is one aspect. So cookies are inherent in the browser, natively in the application. We run this flow, and we actually end up with a token directly in the application. Browser-based logging can be frictionful and non-compliant with regulations. We have much, much more control in how we can safeguard these tokens that when they're in the application rather than in the browser. And we see people trying to do this in non-standard ways. They're trying to kind of shoehorn this into exposing APIs and things of that nature to be able to run this. But there's sort of underlying mechanisms here that needs to be in place to do this in a secure and safe way. So if we look at this from an authentication perspective, we perform user authentication without a browser. We should be able to support any type of authentication mechanism. So it's not sort of a static thing that, oh, we got an authentication API here and we're only rendering sort of a username password field, right? There's tons of different ways of authenticating out there, and all of them should work. In most authorization servers, when you invoke authentication, there's also some type of orchestration workflow situation happening. So it's not only authentication, there's a lot of things that can happen on the authorization server side after authentication. At Curity, we call them authentication actions, but others call them different things. That should also work in this situation, right? Because we do want to be able to enrich the workflow even on mobile devices, and that should not be sort of tied to running these in the browser. We want to be able to handle localization and branding. Like I said, I mean, UX is a pretty big point here, but we do end up having full control over what the authentication screen looks like. And in addition to that, we want to keep using existing sort of OAuth clients and anything around OAuth, right? So it shouldn't be different configurations necessarily for this type of approach. So a traditional code flow that runs in the browser, this is obviously significantly dumbed down for those that are familiar with what a code flow is. But the aspect to look at here is that in the bottom left, we have a mobile device. It points up to a browser that initiates the user authentication in the front channel to the authorization server. That then would kind of, okay, what do I have? I have 5 different authenticators that I should display for the user here, or there's all sorts of mechanisms to control that, right? And then it runs to it. Authentication happens. The back channel call to also the authorization server will redeem sort of this code for tokens, and the token ends up somewhere in the application. If we do this instead with a hypermedia-based flow, it looks like this. So we basically remove that browser and we expose a new API on the authorization server's authentication service, if we want to call it that. This is the Hypermedia API that it exposes there. So it's a new API that the application can talk to. The rest is essentially the same, right? If we look at it from a build-up of flow here, it's an initial request that then receives a response from this Hypermedia API. And the response here can look different, right? It depends on how this OAuth client is configured on the authorization server side. But it could get several options of choosing authenticators and other things. This is sort of the Hypermedia response back to the client. The user or the client acts on this information. If it's as simple as sort of typing in your username and password, that's the provided information that goes back to the server, right? But it could be other things that happens here too. the server then this is the state machine, right? If the server gets a response that it needs to do something with and then give additional options back to the client, it will do that. So this will just go in a loop until we sort of hit a state of we're done. So user-provided information, at some point we redeem, oh, we're done with authentication, and then the authentication result comes back to the client saying, you're done authenticating. That's sort of the no browser part of all of this. It's a little bit less to talk about when it comes to the passwordless aspect. I mean, there's lots to talk about, but I'm sure you've heard this to no end over the last 1, 2, 3 days. So WebAuthn is web authentication. It's essentially a foundation of passkeys, right? So it is compromised by an API for registration and authentication. It is basically the only phishing-resistant passwordless option out there in the market. There's a lot of benefits with this, obviously. It removes this pesky sort of, how do we store the passwords in a safe way? It's not really possible to do. It removes the same password everywhere problem that you've probably heard. It does enable passwordless authentication, and it can act as an additional factor for MFA. And this is, it's somewhat recent, built into both iOS and Android from a perspective of being able to run this natively in the OS itself. It's been possible to run it within the browsers of these devices for a while, but what we want to do here in this case, and what I'm going to show in the demo, is building this also natively into the application. So we get this Hypermedia API directly in the application, and we get authentication directly in the application, even though traditionally WebAuthn, obviously the web protocol, runs in the browser. So very short on sort of the authentication flow here. I have not outlined the registration flow, but it's similar to this. So a request for authentication is met with a challenge that goes back to the client that signs this with a private key to assert it, and then it sends that signature back to the server that verifies it using its public key, and then back is a successful authentication. We're not going to see this in the demo application at all. I just wanted to convey what happens sort of underneath the hood when we authenticate using the passkey there, basically. So it worked. That's good. Although I don't see it here, so it's going to be really tricky for me to navigate. I have a sample demo application that I'm running in an iPhone simulator here. It's a kind of a dumb application. It doesn't really do much. It initiates this authentication flow, and it receives tokens. But we're in an iOS application right now. When I hit Start Authentication here, we're using this is not a browser context that popped up. It's sort of native iOS application pop-up screen. So I have a user already registered. I could register new devices here. If I click Continue, now I get this iOS passkey authentication. I'm going to fake my own fingerprint here because it's a simulator. And now I'm authenticated. So it didn't invoke the browser. We ran a passwordless authentication using passkeys. It was already registered to my account, and we have now received an access token, an ID token, and a refresh token. We can expand this here. We can also run normal OAuth flows here. So if I click refresh token, it triggers a refresh flow to obtain a new access token from the authorization server. So, in conclusion, now I don't have my screen up there. Do this. So, leveraging a Hypermedia API for authentication removes the need for the browser. It gives much, much, much better control of the UX. Application developers on mobile platforms love it. It reduces the friction of sort of popping out to a browser context on mobile application and saves the user or make the user stay within the application itself. WebAuthn itself, or passkeys, removes the password, obviously, and is a really great phishing-resistant option. So combining these two, you get a really great user experience on mobile devices. And I keep saying mobile devices because that's where this is a little bit more important. We don't have to remove the browser on browser-based applications, right? OAuth kind of runs pretty well there. Although it is actually possible to implement using a Hypermedia API in web-based applications too. It's essentially no different, but it doesn't really save as much as it does on mobile devices. And that was it from me. If you have any questions around this, I'm happy to kind of share information. The entire demo project that I have is publicly available on GitHub. You can pull it down and actually run this same demo application that I have here and look at how the source is and how it's built and whatnot. Happy to take any questions if there's time.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jonas. That's really, really interesting work, right? Like the architectural work around the standards to get this much better user flow in the browser, in the mobile device, I think is really important. We do have a couple of minutes for questions. I'm happy to kind of run a mic back if somebody wants to. Yeah, so we got one at the back here.
Thank you, Jonas, for the presentation. The question, maybe I need a clarity whether this API, Hypermedia API, is a replacement for the web client or the web view or an external web user agent, or you can take, basically without much code change, you can drop this Hypermedia API on the mobile application and then still consume the web client. I mean, I just want a clarity.
Yeah. It's a good question. So if I repeat it, just so I understood it right, is this a replacement for sort of the standard way of doing OAuth and OpenID Connect in the browser? Is that the question essentially?
That's a question, or I'm just trying to look from the effort and the migration. If you got to migrate,
right.
What's the effort like?
Yep.
And is it a replacement, or is it more like it's a drop in and plug and play?
It's not a replacement by any means. It's a complement. In fact, there's going to be devices where you have to run it in the web view anyways because they don't support certain things. There's levels of iPhones and levels of iOS in combination that doesn't support native passkeys, right? So, and those will have to pop into the browser because it's just not possible to do, right? There's other parts of this that I haven't talked about because it would be more than a 1 hour talk. It would probably be like a half-day workshop or something like that. And that's, how does the underlying security work in this, right? It's actually a pretty advanced attestation protocol that needs to run underneath because you have mobile applications deployed to app stores, right? You can't put a static secret in there, right? That's going to be reverse engineered immediately, and that's not good. So you actually keep these clients public, and it's got attestation running underneath it. But that also only works on certain mobile devices because not all of them have that secure enclave, right, to hold secrets. And then you need to run fallback options to dynamic client registration and things like that. So the point is there is a migration path. It's not straightforward. You're going to have a bunch of customers out there that have devices that don't support some parts and don't support other parts. It doesn't support anything, and you will have to kind of, as a backup, allow them to go in and run browser-based flows in some regard, and browser-based kind of authentication when passkeys don't run natively.
So if I understand it correct, this is more for any mobile devices with a hardware-backed security module, like a strong box or a secure enclave. So if it doesn't have it, if it has to go to the software base, right, that's when you have another mechanism of attestation to basically.
Essentially, yes. You will get the best experience on more modern devices. But I forget what it is. It's still like iPhone 9 or 10 or something like that has the Enclave, and we're on 16 now. So it's a pretty far backwards compatibility still. Like there's going to be some devices out there that won't work with it fully. You can still run it, but the user experience will be not as good.
Fabulous, thank you. And I think the key takeaway is don't put static secrets in the App Store. Yeah?
For sure, don't do
good.
that.
Fabulous, I think we're pretty much at time. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for filling out the survey after the session. I'm sure that Jonas will be available around coffee if anyone does have any follow-ups. Thank you very much for attending. Enjoy the rest of the day.